holy and acceptable. And then we see how He formed the things, the animals, and then man breathed into breath of life into the nostrils of man so that he could live. And then He saw that he needed a helpmate. And then here we see there is Eve. And then once you have Adam and Eve, we know that the serpent, was beguiled and was a individual of trying to deceive, in which we know that's still the case today in the world we live in, that Satan wants to deceive. He wants to get us to doubt things, and that's nothing new. All the way from the beginning with the creation of man, Satan has been trying to get us to doubt things. He got Eve to doubt, and then we see Adam doubted. And then we see how the blame game came into part, where Adam blamed the woman, Eve blamed the serpent, and then man blamed woman, and then it was in the same belt he blamed God for giving woman to him. And so a lot of blame, a lot of things that we have looked at here in relation to the beginnings. And then they were cast out of the garden, which they had it made, they had it perfect. And then we know that after that generational purpose, the first murder, and then we know that men and women just took on a form of wickedness, of evilness. And then that's when we see that that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And he and his 3 sons were spared when the flood came. And it wasn't just a local flood. It was a universal flood. It was a flood that covered all parts, and every breathing thing that was outside of that ark died, except for Noah, his spouse, the 3 sons, and their spouses. And then we came to the point of where they were in that great ship, that ark, and then they landed. And once we come to that point, we see that they made a form of worship to God. And unfortunately, we saw that Noah became a vineyard. He worked in the vineyard, and he got drunk. And we know that his son looked upon him, and he brought a curse against Canaan. And with that, that's where we came to the conclusion when we stopped of the curse that was put upon Canaan by Noah because of what his son had done. But here we come here, and then we looked into the descendants of Noah, talked about Japheth's descendants, Ham's descendants, Sham's descendants, and that's what we're going to look at here this evening. And as we look at chapter number 10, commonly this is called the Table of Nations. This is what it is called. The genealogy, and especially when we look at any genealogy, it's we're quick to jump over it. We're thinking like, well, these are just a bunch of names I can't pronounce, so I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to skip over them. And sometimes it may seem unimportant to the casual reader, but the information in it helps us understand the major people groups that formed after the flood. There were many different people groups that formed, and in fact, some of the names listed in the Table of Nations can be traced to people groups in the time of Israel's occupation of the Promised Land, and actually even today, this is how that these Table of Nations have come to be. Now, through all these groups came from one man, Noah, and some of them actually became bitter enemies of Israel. So, as we look at this first, we'll read here in verse number 1. It says, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were sons born after the flood." Now, verses 2 through 5 gives us a quick look at the descendants of Japheth. It says, "The sons of Japheth, Gomer, and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshach, and Tyrus, and the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togarmah, and the sons of Javan, Elishah, and Tarshish, and Kittim, and Dodanim. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families in their nations." So Japheth had 7 sons, and he had 7 grandsons. And they settled mainly in the north in modern-day Turkey. This is where that they would have settled, as well as west and south of the Caspian Sea. Now, Mediah, son of Japheth, is the one from whom the Medes descended. This is what we talk in verse number 2. And they settled in what we know now as Persia. We've heard of these names commonly known throughout history, and we'll reference these as we walk through them. Now, the Greeks are descendants of the sons of Javan. The Hellenist, this is a term that also describes Greeks, is probably from Elisheb, one of Javan's sons. So historically, the descendants of Japheth did not cross paths with the history of, or the nation of Israel, but they are mentioned, and this is important to recognize when we talk about prophecy, and we won't get into prophecy a great deal here this evening, but it is important that they are mentioned in prophecy in Ezekiel 27 and also chapter 37 and 39. Also, another thing here, and this is an important one, is the descendants of Ham. And this is found in verses 6 through 20. Let's look at these, and then we'll stop on one of the names that's an important one, and that we'll camp out on just for a little bit. It says, and the sons of Ham, Cush and Mizraim and Phut and Canaan. And the sons of Cush, Seba and Haviah and Sabtha and Ramai and Sabtakai. And the sons of Ramiah, Sheba and Dedan. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. Now, Nimrod plays an important role as we look, and we're going to find out here in chapter number 11, especially with the Tower of Babel. But who was Nimrod? Now, we have a little description here. It tells us that he was a mighty one in the earth, and he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. But who was he? Now, today, if you know anything about slang terms, usually when you call, or I've heard people say someone's a Nimrod, it didn't say they're mighty. You know, oftentimes you hear it of maybe being foolish or making decisions that are not good when you refer to someone as a Nimrod. But who was Nimrod? You maybe have heard that name before when you read this passage of Scripture and you ran across it and you're thinking, who in the world is this guy? What does he have to do with anything about history? What does he have to do with anything about this passage of Scripture? Well, we're going to look at that just for a moment here. It does tell us that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, and also he was mighty and one in the earth. It is very likely that during this time with this reference, and I've looked up a lot of information on Nimrod, that with the animals and things of being a hunter themselves, that he was very skilled. And he would be one today that you could say that when they went out hunting, they didn't come back empty-handed. They came back with a lot. They were able to come back with a lot of food to eat. He was a mighty hunter. He was someone that was respected. And also, I believe he was someone that was possibly quite feared just because of his skill and because of his strength. Some people believe that he could have been quite tall. He could have been a very tall individual, maybe someone that, I don't want to equate him to maybe being like the Incredible Hulk or anything like that, but maybe he was big, he was muscular, and possibly just had a demeanor about himself that made him a skilled leader and also just a skilled individual in the hunting game. Now, Josephus actually records, Josephus is a Jewish historian, and he records and believes that when the building of Babel, which Nimrod was instrumental in this taking place, that this was Nimrod stating that he was building a tower that was sufficient enough that could keep God from destroying humanity again. Now, that's just a little speculation there as well, but Josephus, a Jewish historian, believed that that could be a possibility, and there is some references there in Jewish history. Also, another thing about Nimrod, Nimrod in history has been used as a pivotal figure in a lot of cultural, fictional stories. If you've ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the myth of Hercules, a lot of this was originated out of the story of Nimrod. Now, you're thinking, where in the world did you do this? Well, that's just a lot of digging with some information there. But Nimrod was known as this person of great power. And so it says here, and he was a mighty hunter, this is verse number 9, before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. So what does this tell us? It says, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord, is that people thought it was good to be referenced after Nimrod. And so apparently he had some type of control. He had some type of authority to where he could get people to do things. And they believed what he said. He had a control aspect about him. Now let's look here in verse number 10. And it says, in the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Okay? So what is important here about Shinar? Why is Shinar so important? Now, there are 8 references to Shinar, that word, that civilization there that is listed. There's some in Genesis. There's also some in Joshua. There's a reference in Isaiah, Daniel, and also Zechariah. But when you see Shinar, there is always a reference in connection geographically to Babylon. There's always some type of tie, there's some type of reference that ties the two together. Shinar, now there's actually 5 things that are important as we look at this word Shinar. So it's Shinar. First of all, is that Shinar was the location of the Tower of Babel. Okay? Secondly, Shinar was ruled by a king that fought against Abraham. A king by the name of Afriel was from Shinar. Thirdly, Shinar was associated with temptation because in Joshua chapter number 7, the sin that entered the camp, remember that? With Achan? This was from Shinar. Also, Shinar was associated with Babylonian wickedness and false gods, a reference to Shinar. Also, Shinar is a place that will contain a faithful remnant of Israel in future events. Isaiah chapter number 11 talks about the future millennial kingdom with the remnant. And see, Shinar is also significant in its connection to the worldly historical rebellion of how the rebellion against God took place. All this comes back to this place of Babel because the building of Babel, and I know we're getting to that in chapter number 11, but the building of Babel was in direct disobedience to God. That's what we have to figure out. That's what we've got to understand from this. So, God had wiped the wickedness off the face of the earth, okay? Now, sin still remained. Don't get me wrong. Sin still remained because we see that with Noah. We see that with his children and their spouses. They still had to deal with the issue of sin. And all that wickedness had been taken away, and that we know that God promised He would not destroy the world once again by flood because we know that we have the promise, the covenant of the rainbow. And isn't it a beautiful sight to see that after it rains, you see that rainbow, and it's just a reminder to know that God keeps His promises. Just a beautiful promise, a reminder there. But here we see that sin is still here, wickedness is still here, and so once again, wickedness has raised its head from the ground, and here we see disobedience against God. So let's continue reading here in verse number 11. And so out of that land went forth Ashur and builded Nineveh, and the city Rehoboth and Calah, and Rison between Nineveh and Calah, the same as a great city. And Mizraim begat Ludim, and Anaim, and Labim, and Naphthatim, and Pathrasim, and Casluhim, out of whom came Philistine, and which that is also a reference to Philistines. So You getting the picture here of how all this has taken place? And remember, once again, this is the table of nations. This is descendants here as we look at them. And Capithrim and Canaan beget Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgasite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zimmerite, and the Hampathite. And afterward, where the families of the Canaanites spread abroad, and the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Geshur, and to Gaza, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah. Are these names starting to ring a bell here? These are all these table of nations. And Admah and Zebolim, even unto Lashah. These are the sons of Ham, after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and in their nations. Now, here's just a thought. And like I said, when you read this and you know history, if you were reading a book, you would not think about this if you'd read it for the first time unless you had read it and you know the whole story. Often I wonder, how much trouble would it have saved if Ham had not boarded the ark? Had not boarded the ark, how much would that have prevented problems? How would that have prevented a lot of problems for the Israelites? It would have spared them from the Egyptians. It would have spared them from the Philistines. It would have spared them from the Canaanites. And it would also have spared them from the Babylonians. But we also have to ask ourselves this question. Look what it says in Joshua 23, verse 11 through 13. Like I said, I'm just thinking here about that, but there's a reason why. It says, take good heed, therefore, unto yourselves that you love the Lord your God. Else, if you do in any wise go back and cleave unto the remnant of these nations, even these that remain among you, and shall make marriages with them, and go in unto you, and they to you. Know for certainty that the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps unto you, and scourges in your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from all this good land which the Lord your God hath given you. So here's a question as we think about that first question I posed, and then we look at this verse, is why did God allow the descendants of Ham to become so powerful? Yeah, okay. Anybody else with a thought? I personally feel like, and you touched on this a little bit, Margie, there, is so that God could show His power by, yes, defeating them, but also His sovereignty by allowing Israel to be chastened by these nations. Now remember, and this is hard sometimes for us to understand, is that God used wicked rulers to put His people under subjection. I mean, we think about King Nebuchadnezzar. We think about Babylonia. They were under captivity. God used wicked rulers because His people were not listening and they lived in disobedience. So in the grand scheme of things, all right, we have to look at the grand scheme of things. Sometimes we have tunnel vision, but we don't look at the whole picture of how God works outside of where we are, and He works outside of time, and He works according to His purpose and His plan. And sometimes, yes, we are very limited in our thinking, but we're talking about a God that is infinite in wisdom. We are finite. We are very limited. And God had a purpose and He had a plan, and that's why He allowed this to take place. I mean, God had this all, nothing surprises God. God knew this before the foundations of the world. He knew all these things, and so that's why that a lot of this takes place. Because, yeah, I read this and I'm thinking, you know, it'd been good for Ham just to stay off the boat, all these descendants here. But God had a plan. God had a plan always. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful. But also we look at the descendants of Shem. And it says, unto Shem also the father of all the children of Ebner, the brother of Japheth, and to the elder, even to him were born children, the children of Shem, Elam, and Ashur, and Arphaxad, and Lud, and Azram, and the children of Azram, Uz, and Hul, and Jether, and Mash. And Ariphaz, and beget Selah, and Selah beget Abner. And unto Abner were born two sons, the name was Pegleg, for in his days was the earth divided. And his brother's name was Jokthan. And Jokthan begat Almadad, and Selah, and Hazmareth, and Jerah, and Hadram, and Uzal, and Diklah, and Obal, and Abimelech, and Sheba, and Ophir, and Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the sons of Jokthan, and their dwelling was from Mesha, as thou goest unto Sephirah, a mount of the east. And these are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, and their lands, after their nations. And these are the families of the sons of Noah, and their generations and their nations. And by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So God had told all these descendants, he said, be fruitful and multiply, and to spread across the face of the earth. But what happened here, as we come to chapter number 11, is that they stayed together. All right? And the people were of all one language. And so that comes here to chapter number 11. And we're going to say the spreading of the nations. And it says in verse number 1, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Now, I don't really know exactly how they spoke or what it may have been like, or what their gestures was like, with how that they would have conversed with each other, but it was one language and of one speech. And it says here, it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, this is verse number 2, that they found a plain in the land of, once again, Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick from stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Now, there were a lot of people. There were a lot of people that were there, and it was a gathering, and they wanted to make a structure that would reach high. And like I said, with Nimrod, he wanted to build something, and I believe there's possibly some truth to that. He wanted to build a structure that was sufficient for the people for maybe safety, but a place to come that they could convene. And this was something that was totally in disobedience to God. And I think one of the advantages of having one language would be that a leader like Nimrod could control people much more easily. Today, if you're at a job site or you're working someone and there's language barriers, you have to have an interpreter, or you have to be able to know different languages. I know job sites, there's some individuals that have Hispanic workers, and hopefully they're legal. All right, if not, ICE will get them. But the thing is, if they're not speaking fluent English and they only speak well in the Hispanic language, then there has to be an interpreter, and you have to be able to know how to translate for them. But to be able to have one language, I'm sure Nimrod used this at his advantage and said, okay, this is the control that I have over these people. Now, beginning in verse number 1, there is a chiastic structure. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before or not, but there is a chiastic structure that goes through verse number 9 and is worth noting. Now, what is a chiastic structure? It is a literary device to emphasize contrast. And so what this means, in the case of Genesis chapter 11, the contrast is between the people of Babel and God. This structure emphasizes that everything the people determined to do was prevented by God. Okay? Now, Nimrod was a mighty warrior, and he was a mighty individual. He was a strong individual. He had a rule over the people. But where he was flawed, he may have been mighty in hunting, and he may have been a very good leader to get people to do these things, was the humility aspect. See, he was a very selfish individual. Boy, I'll tell you what, there's nothing new in our culture today. The same thing's going on, a very selfish society. A lot of selfishness. Not selflessness, but selfishness that goes on. They honored self and not God. They wanted to honor themselves and not honor the Creator. And so it tells us here in verse number 5, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. Now, here's just a question, and I've looked on this, and maybe you can give me what your thought is. And the Lord came down to see the city. Do you think that He actually dwelt there and was able to see? Or is this just a direct reference to seeing what's going on from above? I don't know. I've always wondered that about that verse. Anybody with a thought? They came down? Yeah. 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 I wonder when He was there how that worked with the people.
I don't think they recognized him as Jesus.
You think He just...
You know how he did before he would be there, and they didn't know it was him for a little bit.
It's an interesting verse, isn't it? When you read that, it is. It is for sure. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they began to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Now, this is talking about what they have imagined to do. You've got to understand important literary words here of references to the context of this passage. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language. Now, another thing here. I don't know if you thought about this before. Is this a direct reference here in verse number 7 of the Holy Trinity? Let us go down. I think so. It says, so, go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, and they left off to build the city. Now, I've always thought this to be sort of funny. It's sort of one of those moments that I don't know how it would have happened. I don't know the reactions of people. But can you imagine you're working together, you're speaking the same language, and then you turn around and you say something to the person next to you, and they say something to you, and they're saying something totally different. Now, I don't know what languages were chosen that were given to them of how they interacted. But I mean, can you imagine? You're speaking to someone, and they're going, I have no idea what you're saying. And the other person is saying, I have no clue. And so God confused them. And they scattered. And actually, when you think of Babel, that's what that word means. It means confusion. So they were confused and they scattered. As soon as they looked at each other, they thought, I cannot understand what you're saying. You know, it's sort of like what you say, it might as well be Greek. You know, I heard that when I was in seminary. Someone used to use that joke a lot when we couldn't understand a text. It's got to be Greek. You know, we can't understand it. But here we see, so the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. And that's where people groups scattered. That's where they went, to different places. The people of Egypt, where they went to their locations. The Philistines, that's where people scattered. They were no longer together. And poor old Nimrod, I mean, he thought he had everything under control. And the Lord said, hey, buddy, I'm the one that's in control. You know, that's just like in our culture today. Some people say that they're in control and they think they can do this and do that. They're only allowed to have what leadership they temporarily have because it's been given from above. The final say is from the Lord. He's the one that's in control. See, regardless of what goes on in our world today, and this is a great truth I always like to remind myself of from time to time, especially when we got craziness, wickedness in our world, is that regardless of how bad that it gets, I know the one that's still on the throne. He's in control. He's in control of all things. So regardless of how bad it gets, I know we have the promise, and I know the one that said we have the victory. So that's what we claim. That's what we hold on to. So that's something to remember. So we see this here with God's judgment that He has scattered them. Now, thinking about Babel just for a moment, let's go back to it. No one knows how tall this tower got. I mean, it could have been as tall as the Sun Sphere in Knoxville. I don't know. I mean, Sun Sphere really isn't super tall. I was driving by it the other day, and actually, I'd forgotten that Miriam had never been over that direction before. We were coming back from Henley Street Bridge, and she looked over at that, and she said, "What is that big ball?" I said, "That's the Sun Sphere. That was built during the World's Fair in 1982. It was specifically built for that." But I just thought to myself, "Wow, what is that?" She was thinking, "What is that over there on top of that building?" I was explaining it to her. But nobody knows the size. I mean, when you think about buildings in our world today, there's a lot that are huge. I mean, we've mentioned this before about Mount Everest. Mount Everest, according to our last recorded documents, is about 29,000, a little over 29,000 feet tall. But in the grand scheme of things, Mount Everest is actually small in comparison to our universe. So this Tower of Babel was just very small in the grand scheme of things. But when we think about it, God shook things up. And He scattered these people for a purpose. And we know how that's all the nations were developed. And this will better explain how that things came to be, especially with Israel and their enemies of the Philistines and others as well. All right, before we get to this next part here, we got some more names to read here, and this is Shem's line to Abram, and this is important because Shem, his line, through this line will be the Redeemer, who is Christ. But this leads through the redemptive line to Abram, and then verses 31 and 32 of the same chapter we'll pick up in our next part. Any questions so far before we read this lineage? And I'm not just reading them just so I can butcher the names, but these names are important because it talks about the groups, it talks about the nations and how important that they are in lineage and how people were descendants. I believe so. It was a selfless thing, a self-focused thing. I could give you a great, maybe not a great, but an example of this. You know what a ziggurat is, right? Ziggurat, or you know, the towers of worship that are built across the world. Like you have some of the wonders of the world. I've been able to see a couple of them. I've been to Egypt. I saw the pyramids of Giza. And all of these were built in a form of worship. And the Egyptians were very creative. I mean, at the time, they were beautiful. As time has passed, we're talking thousands and thousands of years have passed since the Egyptians built those. But it was a form of their style of worship. And I think that with this, we see a self-focused thing here. And this was a direct disobedience to God. And it's just like for us today. Anything that we do that is outside the will of God is disobedience. Like when we try to live outside the will of God, when we do anything that's ungodly, it is disobedience. And these people were directly disobeying what God had told them to do. Because if you look back, I think it's Genesis 9:1. What was the direct commandment there that was given? Anybody remember? To fill the earth. It wasn't to buddy up and hold hands and stand around here together. But he said to them, he blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. That was the command that was given by God, but they were in direct disobedience to that. And it's nothing different today. I mean, there's disobedience everywhere, disobedience to God. And that's been through all different types of cultures. You look at the Egyptians. I mean, you look at cultures that have tried to make their way, their personal way to enlightenment or to say there's something outside of Christ. It's all disobedience. And we find that a lot today with religions per se that say that you can achieve certain things, which we've talked about that before. All right, let's look at this. This will be the last part here. This is Shem's line to Abram. So once again, this is descendants, and these are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and got Aphrexed 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after he begat Aphrexed 500 years and begat sons and daughters. And Arphaxad lived 35 years and begat Salah. And Arphaxad lived after he begat Salah 403 years and begat sons and daughters. And Salah lived 30 years and begat Eber. And Salah lived after he begat Eber 403 years and begat sons and daughters. And Eber lived 34 years and begat Peleg. And Eber lived after he begat Peleg 430 years and begat sons and daughters. Peleg lived 30 years and begat Reu. And Peleg lived after he begat Reu 209 years and begat sons and daughters. And Reu lived 32 years and begat Serug. And Reu lived after he begat Serug 207 years and begat sons and daughters. And Serug lived 30 years and begat Nahor. And Serug lived after he begat Nahor 200 years and begat sons and daughters. And Nahor lived 29 years and begat Terah. And Nahor lived after he begat Terah 119 years and begat sons and daughters. And Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. Now we know the story with Abram and Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. And the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Ishka. But Sarai was barren. She had no child. All right, so that's the descendants there. And this will kind of move us next week into verses 31 and 30, and this will be Abram's call. But interesting, isn't it? The descendants, how all this comes to be. Don't know if you've ever thought about that before or not. With the descendants there, Ham. It's interesting how you see all this take place, why all this does take place, and how God's plan is unfolding as we look at the lineage here through these families and through Shem's line. All right, anybody with a question, thought on any of that?
Okay, I understand when God dispersed all the people in the Tower of Babel. Okay, I can in my mind picture, that's where we get our different languages.
Mm-hmm.
Where did how did the change of appearance, like the skin color, the shape of the eyes, was that because of where they lived, they adapted to their environment, or were they already like that before he dispersed them?
I think a lot of that took place after they were dispersed, because I don't know how many years would have surpassed or since the flood when this took place per se, but I think that after they were dispersed and they went to their different lands. I think over time there would have been changes. I can't really explain that to the best of my ability, but I think that over time there would have been changes with appearance. Um, uh, yeah, it's possible. It's possible with changes. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see the skin color.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the more you're in the sun, the darker your skin gets. But I don't know where the shape of the eyes, you know, the Asian, was it windy a lot and they squinted? Or?
I don't know. I don't know. I think like I don't know. I mean, like I would think like who knows? I mean, I think like with me having red hair, and you ever done those tests before where you send off stuff and they send it back to you until you have descendants? And I did it once, and I was hoping that there was a king somewhere that I was related to. No, but I had some blood, some descendants actually from Ireland when I found that out. When looking back, and you can find connections with people. But thinking about it, we're all descendants, obviously, of Noah, but also we're descendants of Adam and Eve. But I think just over time, there have been changes. How do I explain that? I don't know. I don't know why that there would have been changes other than just over time appearances. That is a good question.
Well, I know
Yeah. Yeah.
environment plays a big role because
Yeah.
just here in the United States, there's a big difference between southern people, truly southern people,
Yeah.
and truly northern people. I mean,
Yeah.
just in their mannerisms and
Yeah.
so you know, maybe the environment just changed people over generations.
It's possible. It's possible. Yeah. Just,
So Adam and Eve were already dead when this flood happened.
oh, they would have had to have been. Yeah.
So that was how many years after Adam and Eve?
I'd have to go back and look.
Huh? 1,700 years?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So then all the kids would have been dead too.
Very possible. Yeah.
Then how are we descendants of them?
Having kids and their kids.
They all got killed in the flood.
Well, no, and then would have still been descendants because they had to have been. Yeah. Someone says brought them down. But I mean, well, the only difference is like Noah was, and his sons, their spouses were intertwined. They were related to everybody, but the difference was Noah found grace in the eyes of God. And so when everybody was taken out, I mean, every living, breathing individual was taken out in the flood except for Noah and his family. And so, yes, we're descendants of Adam and Eve, but also we're descendants of Noah because that was, yes. So I look at it. Yeah. Because that's where we enter.
Why never, it's not recording the death of Adam and Eve? Why do you think that was not recorded in the Bible?
Yeah, Adam's is. Yeah.
Was it?
Yeah, Adams is in there. Yeah. I'd have to go back and look at the number. I can't remember. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's where
Yeah.
it's recorded.
Yeah. And so,
I probably read that, but
yeah, and it's hard sometimes because usually like skip over because a lot of that is in reference to talking about beget, somebody lives so long. And like I said, it's easy to skip over this, but if you do, you miss out on some of these names and some of the lineage, especially with talking about here at the end of chapter number 11 about the descendants of now we see Abram, we see Lot, and we know what comes to play later on with those two. So, yeah. Stephen, did you have your hand up earlier?
maybe died.
Yeah.
developed from that original first group that went there would then have that genetic tendency to have that eye shape or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, and we're talking about thousands of years of genetic. I mean, eventually come into play. I mean, that's why we have some people that have really dark skin, and we have some people that have really light skin. And different parts of the world, you have obviously darker skin, whiter skin. Even like if you ever have a chance to go to Hawaii, who have been here, I've been once, and when you see someone that is from Japan and you see somebody that's from Hawaii, they look sort of similar in some ways, but there's a different skin tone, if you notice. And so, yeah, it's just a difference of how things, I hate to use the word evolved, but it's just how that things have changed over time with genetic makeup of how that were made. So that's one of those that's sort of like it's hard to explain because we don't really know because we don't know everybody and how everybody looked over the period of time. We can only guess at that. But that's the only thing that we can assume is that there was a change over time when people were born. Yeah. Noah came off that spaceship. No, no. Any other questions on anything? It's an interesting passage, though, because it just goes to show you that if you think you're in control, you're really not. Nimrod thought he was in control. He literally believed that. And we say how this has with reference Shinar and Babylonia. There's always some type of connection that's there, and that's key, especially for Israel, future stories, and how all this comes to play. So interesting to look at. All right. Nobody else has a thought? Thank you for being attentive. Hopefully this has been encouraging for you. I like to dig into stuff and look, and I don't have the answer to everything. I don't say that I do, but it's always good to talk about it and learn, because sometimes you look at something and thought, oh, I haven't thought about that before. And it gets your wheels is burning, and it makes you want to study the Word more. And that should be your desire, is to learn more about the Lord, obviously. All right, let's stand together tonight, and we'll pray. Dustin, would you like to pray for us? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, all right, okay.
Lord, thank you for your teaching this evening. Thank you for allowing the weather to clear, let us be here this evening. And Lord, I pray that the upcoming weather this weekend, I pray that it will hold out the way we'll be able to return here this weekend, Lord. Lord, I pray that you do with all of the prayer requests mentioned. I pray that you lift them up whatever way that you can to help them. Lord, I pray that you will be with us as we go throughout the rest of the week. Keep us safe, health, and let us return. In your name I pray, amen.
Amen, amen.